So I often talk about how what I'm sharing is just a perspective, which I guess we could say it is. And um, one way I've been referring to it of late is very broadly speaking, is it's the perspective of experience itself and sort of taking experience as being what's primary, whatever experience is exactly. But we could contrast it with, I think, what we're ordinarily more used to, which is we may not appreciate this, but it's actually kind of a conceptual perspective. And I'll try to clarify that, what I mean by that as we go along here. But um, and so a central part of what I'm sharing with people is beginning to examining how our actual experience is distinct from, deviates from in really significant ways from what we actually think is going on. And that turns out to be really quite something to discover that. So one of the things I wanted to explore right now with you is probably one of our most taken for granted assumptions, is the assumption of there being boundaries, the assumption of there being um, separation between one phenomena and the next, what we would call phenomena. So one easy place, I think, to explore this is to look at vision. So just with your eyes open, to just explore the visual field, and without really, I mean, we just take for granted for the most part that we're seeing separate objects, right? I'm seeing the sky, what I would call sky, and then kind of a horizon at the bottom of the sky, and then a place where there's land, which is not sky, and then this is the view I'm seeing, and then a place where the land then ends and what I would call the sea, because I can see Santa Monica Bay. I'm in Los Angeles right now. And there's the sea, so it's distinct from the land, which is distinct from the sky and distinct from the horizon. And then there, as a part of the visual field, I see, a little hill there that's separate from what's not a hill, which is kind of a valley that then extends out to the sea, and so on, right? And what I what I invite you to just notice right now is in your visual field how what from one perspective looks like pieces or is thought about as being separate pieces, you literally cannot find visually pieces. You see a single whole, don't you? You see one visual field. You see a continuum. You don't actually see a place where, or at least I'm not, where there's not a gap, right? There's not a gap between, like, at what point does the sky cease to be sky and then the non-sky begin? At what point does that land come to a definitive end and what I call the sea begin? I mean, if you even, think about it, just, just look and see how, just like the colors of a rainbow, which appear discrete and separate, are actually a continuum. You don't actually find a clear demarcation anywhere. This is extraordinary because, again, we take for granted conceptually, just consensus reality, that the world is made of pieces, right? But in the visual field, you don't find pieces, you find a whole that shows up as what we could call separate parts. But you can't find the demarcation. You cannot find it in the visual field. Really, you could say what you're seeing is a gradation of color and light and shading. But again, it's a continuum, isn't it? It's one thing. Seamless. There's no There's no gaps anywhere. So just notice that. Notice that. There's no boundaries in the visual field. So that's looking at sort of one sense field. It's very interesting. So if you notice a visual field right now, and then you're hearing the sound of my voice, right? What we call the auditory field, let's say, the field of sound. Now, again, they appear as distinct phenomena, don't they? Like recognizable dimensions of experience, let's say. But it's really wild because, again, you can't actually find a place where the visual field somehow, here's the clear, delineated, defined field with this boundary around it, which is what enables us to define it, right? There's the boundary. There's what's vision or light, and then what's not that, right? Let's say sound. So where the field of light is distinct from the field of sound. But look in your experience right now and see if you can find any separation between the two. It's paradoxical because they appear as identifiably separate, distinct phenomena, right? And yet feel the way in which they're seamless with each other. They're blending with each other in a sense, experientially. You can't find where one ends and the other begins. It's like, it's a bit like, I've used this analogy before, but you can have a meal, let's say a bowl of soup, and there's all these distinctive flavors in the bowl of soup, right? They show up as distinctive flavors: salty, spicy, sweet, whatever the flavors are, right? And yet, again, just like I'm saying with the field of vision and the field of sound, you can't, it's everything is mixed together in this seamless stew of wholeness that shows up as distinctive flavors and qualities and characteristics. Same thing with the sphere of thinking. Okay, again, have a thought, create a thought right now of, you know, the thought of what you're going to do when the Zoom call ends. You know, I'm going to go for a walk, or so you just form that thought, and there's that thought in the field of thinking, let's call it, the dimension of thinking, that's distinct from sound and distinct from color and light, right? As qualities or flavors of experiencing. And yet again, where is the boundary of thought? Where is its definitional line? That you can't find it. It blends together and yet shows up as distinct. That sounds contradictory, but that's our actual experience, isn't it? Isn't that wild? It's really something. So let's look at another presumed boundary. So something's being perceived right now. So I'm perceiving the bookshelf, I'm perceiving the computer, I'm perceiving sound of my voice, I'm perceiving light and color, all these things being perceived. Call them the objects of perception. They could be what I call external to me or internal to me. And then there's the perceiving function, call it consciousness, call it awareness. So what's perceiving and then what's being perceived. I just talked about it like they're two separate things. And in some ways we can have that sense of, oh yeah, here's the perceiving function, this thing called awareness, consciousness. And then there's the objects being perceived. So I'm talking about them like they're separate. And in some sense, we can talk about them like that and experience them as distinctive dimensions of reality. But once again, where is the boundary? Where is the demarcation? Where is the gap between the perceiver and the perceived? You get to some point where the perceiver goes click and perception begins, the perceived begins. Doesn't work like that. I mean, at least not from the Again, from the perspective of experiencing itself, I mean, I can conceive of a perceiver and the perceived, but I'm not experiencing a perceiver and a perceived. I'm experiencing, well, I don't know what I'm experiencing, but but we could call it perceiving or experiencing or existence, reality. I mean, feel your, here's another one, feel what we call the body as an experience, okay, not as a concept. And then whatever is not body, the environment within which the body presumably exists, right? Where is the boundary? Is there a boundary that you can find? Feel what you think of as yourself, the individual that is you, the individual of John, the individual of Zoe, of Joan, of Wayne, all the various people on the call. Feel the sense of I'm an individual, an autonomous creature with a body, with a set of characteristics, personality, quirks, a mind, a history. And this individual presumably lives in a world. But feel the experience right now and feel that the way in which, again, no, you just absolutely cannot find a boundary between what we call self and the world. Where is it? Where's the boundary? Where do I end what I call I? I mean, the tendency of consciousness is to sort of, here's the field of experiencing, this vast infinite field of experiencing, and then sort of we pick a part of that and call that I. But it's what is that? Am I not the whole field of experiencing? After all, I can't find a clear dividing line between self and other. So from this experiential vantage, as we're just sitting here now, feeling the boundaryless, seamless nature of this experiencing, this flow of experiencing, which is very much feels like a flow, always changing. There is no other, literally. From this vantage, there's not something, some event, some phenomena occurring to me. That's not what's happening from this vantage. There's just whatever is happening, however that might be described. There's no, from this perspective, experiential perspective, there's no inside or outside. Because again, no demarcation can be found. So let's just say, let's go empirical here. And if I can't find it, then it doesn't exist. I can't find the demarcation between inside and outside. So where is inside and outside? From this experiential vantage, there's not someone looking for something. So not surprisingly, that this perspective can give rise to a sense of, or you could say sort of its I guess, implication, or I don't really know what to call it, but is one of ease, because there's not two things pushing or pulling or struggling with one another in some way, or not one thing feeling it's the victim of something else or at the risk or mercy of something else. That's not what's happening from this vantage, right? I'm not the victim of anything from this vantage. From this vantage, there's not an I, nor are there things, which isn't to say there's nothing, because there's this unthinkable sense of aliveness, of potency, of vibrancy, of presence. But not one thing pushing against another, not one thing fearing another thing, feeling something is threatening. That isn't here. I mean, that perspective can arise and does arise. We all know that feeling of something's happening to me and I have to figure that out or free myself of it or understand it or work through it or heal it or get rid of it, avoid it. Um, but then you can come back, if you will. One can recognize the perspective we're exploring right now, and that has a whole different feel to it. It has a whole different sense to it. It has a all these dichotomists, here and there, inside, outside, they're 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 all suggesting otherness. They're suggesting separation. And again, from this perspective, separation can be found. This is a perspective of the sea itself. And our ordinary notion is of being somehow a wave, of existence navigating this vast ocean of the world. And that includes other potentially challenging, threatening, troubling, difficult waves, right, that could affect us. Here's this wave, and I can be affected by these other waves. But the waves are, the experiential perspective just, it reveals that there aren't waves, because it's a continuum, right? There aren't waves. There's just a sea. And in a way, you can't even say you can't say there's something. You can't, because in a way, when we name things, this is why, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. You can't really call it something in a sense. I mean, you can, but I wrote many, many years ago in the first book I wrote, this tiny little passage that essentially said that there is no God because there's only God. Because when we name something, we say, oh, God, it suggests there's something that isn't God. Otherwise, why would you have a name for it, right? God as opposed to what? It's like we designate something. That's what we do with our defining. I designate this is this, and I put a ring around it. I put I put a boundary around it. That's what the definitions do. But I've just been exploring with you how there is no boundary from this other vantage. And so there's just this. It has a different feel, doesn't it? And ultimately, you can't really say what that is. I mean, it's one thing about this boundlessness, boundaryless field of experiencing is that it's just too um, it constantly eludes description and definition, right? Again, you can't put a boundary around it. So how do you define it? When it is everything, how do you define it? But here we are experiencing it. So it's not far away. It's not some lofty thing that only the special few can recognize. It's our very experience right now, isn't it? It's this experience is the boundlessness, because no boundary can be found in this experience. So here it is. No actual concrete conclusion can be made of what's here. The here is infinity because it's indeterminate. It's fathomless. That's not off anywhere again in some special place. It's here. It's this current moment. There is no other moment anyway. So which is convenient. Because you don't have to go anywhere to find it, to seek it out. It's finding us in every moment.